In the rain-washed hush of late afternoon, Eleanor Harrow stepped from her father's humble carriage with the poise of a woman who had long learned to quiet her fears before anyone could see them tremble. The cobblestones glistened beneath her feet, reflecting blurred lantern light as Ravensbridge Manor rose above her like a monument carved from judgment itself. Clara clung to her arm, shivering despite the shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders. Lydia pressed a gloved hand to her bonnet to guard against the damp breeze, while Rose whispered unbroken prayers under her breath, as if divine mercy might soften the harsh lines of fate. Inside the vast vestibule, warmth wrapped around them in a sweep of beeswax, cedar, and old stone. Footmen lined the walls, their expressions schooled into neutrality, though their eyes glimmered with curiosity. Eleanor felt her limp grow more pronounced as she crossed the gleaming marble, each step echoing like a confession she never offered. She wished she had worn a gown that hid her uneven gait, but poverty announced itself in fraying hems and patched seams. Still, she drew in a steadying breath and lifted her chin, reminding herself that dignity remained her only armor. Duke Lucian Ravensbridge entered the hall with the controlled elegance of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His tall frame cast a long shadow beneath the chandeliers, and his silver-topped cane clicked softly against the floor as he approached. Light glinted along the strict lines of his coat, catching the cool, winter brightness of his eyes. When his gaze swept over the Harrow sisters, Eleanor felt the air tighten, for his attention lingered upon her just an instant longer than propriety allowed, a pause sharp enough to stir both dread and curiosity. Then Mr. Harrow collapsed to his knees. The sound of it, a man's despair meeting hard marble, rang through the hall with the finality of falling stone. Eleanor reached toward him, but Clara's small fingers tightened fearfully around her arm, anchoring her in place. Lydia's cheeks drained of color, while Rose's breath broke into trembling sobs. "Your Grace," Mr. Harrow rasped, his voice raw from nights of unrest. "Take any one of my daughters. Only forgive my debt. I beg you. I have nothing else." Whispers burst like sparks along the hall's edges. A servant gasped. A noblewoman above shifted forward to catch every word. Eleanor felt the sting of the murmurs pierce her skin. She had known her father's desperation, but not that it had grown sharp enough to carve his daughters into bargaining chips. She felt her heart twist, heavy with humiliation and sorrow for the man he had become under crushing debt. The Duke remained silent. His gaze moved across the family like a measured weight. Lydia's beauty trembling under pressure, Rose's gentleness swallowed by fear, Clara trembling behind Eleanor. And finally Eleanor herself, still, resolute, unwilling to bow even as her pulse thrummed with dread. "Rise, Mr. Harrow," Lucian said at last, though softer than his usual tone. A man should not kneel for such a request. But her father did not rise. His shoulders shook violently as he seized Eleanor's wrist and pulled her forward, presenting her as though she were nothing more than a final offering from a ruined man. "Eleanor is strong," he murmured, voice cracked thin. She would endure anything. Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks, humiliation settling deep beneath her ribs. She tore her wrist free, breath unsteady but voice firm. "I'm not a payment," she whispered. The hall froze. The candles flickered as though listening. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, not pity, but something sharper, startled, as if he had not expected resistance from the daughter society deemed least valuable. "You would offer her?" he asked her father quietly. "The daughter who steadies your household when you cannot?" "I beg you, Your Grace," her father pleaded again, head bowed nearly to the floor. "Choose anyone. Mercy for debt. It is all I have left." Another wave of whispers rippled outward. Will he choose the plain one? Will he make her servant? Or worse? Eleanor felt each word settle over her like a shroud she could not lift. Lucian inhaled slowly, his restraint razor-thin but unbroken. "Return tomorrow," he said, his voice calm but impenetrable. "I will give you my answer then." Gasps broke from the gallery. Lydia stiffened, Rose's tears quickened, and Clara burrowed closer to Eleanor. Eleanor herself felt the floor tilt subtly beneath her feet, as though her world were slipping into a new shape she could not yet imagine. As the Harrow family was escorted toward the door, Eleanor allowed herself one final glance back. The Duke stood motionless at the top of the grand staircase, shadows coiling around him like a second cloak. His gaze met hers, not cruel, not pitying, but unbearably steady, holding a question she could not decipher. They stepped outside into the deepening dusk. The rain thickened, cold drops sliding across her cheeks like a tolling bell. The cobblestones blurred silver beneath their feet as the world seemed to draw a breath between what had been and what was coming. As they reached the carriage, Eleanor paused beneath the dripping eaves, letting cold rain cling to her lashes. Her father sank inside, hollowed by regret, while her sisters gathered close in uneasy silence. Yet she lingered, drawn toward the faint glow in the manor's upper windows. Something in the Duke's restrained gaze haunted her, a quiet tension, an unspoken purpose, as though he carried a decision far beyond debt or desperation. The rain slid down her cheek, cool and insistent, urging her toward the waiting carriage. Yet she stood unmoving, sensing the world had shifted in a way she could not name. She felt tomorrow approaching like a storm-laden promise darkly. I end the restless days after the plea at Ravensbridge. The Harrow household lived as though balanced on the thinnest edge of a knife. Morning light filtered through threadbare curtains, catching dust motes that drifted like fragile hopes, while Lydia paced the sitting room with clipped steps, her ribbons trembling each time she turned sharply toward the door. Rose stitched worn linen with quiet determination, her soft prayers stitched into every careful seam. Clara hovered by the window, watching the pale winter sky as though an answer might descend at any moment. And Eleanor, poised, composed, yet trembling somewhere deep beneath the ribs, moved through the house like a shadow, striving to remain whole. Their father paced behind his study door until dusk, his footsteps betraying a soul cornered by shame. Whispers from the town reached them swiftly, curling beneath their doors with cruel accuracy. In tea rooms, scented with bergamot and gossip, ladies speculated on which daughter would be chosen, as though the Duke were selecting fabric for a coat rather than a living woman. Children in the marketplace watched Eleanor curiously, their innocence contrasting the sharp adult stares cast upon her uneven gait. Eleanor kept her chin raised, but every murmur carved into her like a cold blade. Still, she walked with dignity, even when dignity cost more than comfort. On the third morning, a footman from Ravensbridge arrived, immaculate in polished boots that gleamed against the modest Harrow doorstep. He carried a sealed envelope and a small box bound with blue ribbon. Lydia all but leapt to claim it, but the footman bowed and declared, "For Miss Eleanor Harrow, by order of His Grace." Silence cracked through the room like thunder. Eleanor accepted the box with steady hands, though her pulse thrummed wildly. Inside lay a pair of finely crafted walking shoes, simple, beautiful, and unmistakably tailored to ease her limp. The accompanying note, written in a restrained, elegant hand, read, "No lady should stand in pain before my household. Accept these as remedy, not obligation." Lydia scoffed that the gift lacked splendor. Clara asked if it meant marriage. Rose watched Eleanor with gentle, perceptive eyes. Eleanor felt something tighten within her, an uneasy mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and a deep yearning she had never allowed herself to name. She set the shoes beside her small bed, unable to hide them away. Yet with each hour that passed, rumors twisted the gesture into something monstrous. Whispers that the Duke pitied her, desired her, or wished to bind her to him through quiet manipulation. 2 days later, a second token arrived. A slim leather-bound poetry volume, embossed in gold, bearing a solitary violet pressed between its pages. One line was faintly underlined. "What the world calls broken, heaven may name beloved." The word struck her so deeply she felt her breath catch. Someone had chosen these words deliberately, with knowledge of her private sorrow. Clara insisted it meant the Duke must admire her. Lydia hissed that he was playing with their family's desperation. Rose whispered that Eleanor deserved to be seen, even if the seeing frightened her. Eleanor held the book close that night, unsure whether the gesture was mercy or peril. Soon after, an invitation arrived bearing the Raven crest, summoning the Harrow family to a grand ball at Ravensbridge. Their father seized upon it as evidence that the Duke would soon resolve their fate. Lydia rejoiced. Rose fretted. Clara trembled. And Eleanor felt dread and inevitability swirl within her like storm clouds gathering. That evening she dressed with quiet resolve, smoothing her modest gown and fastening her hair with simple pins. When she slipped on the new shoes, her steps felt strangely secure, as though someone had steadied the ground beneath her. The ballroom of Ravensbridge glowed with candlelight, chandeliers scattering warm radiance across polished floors and glittering jewels. The Harrow sisters entered gently, like sparrows among peacocks. Eleanor felt the air shift the instant she stepped inside. Nobles turned, whispering behind feathered fans. Eyes slid toward her with fascination, disdain, or something colder. Across the ballroom, the Duke stood tall, his gaze flickering toward her with sudden intensity before he began moving through the crowd. Whispers bloomed. "He goes to the eldest," someone murmured. "The plain one," said another. "The one with the limp," added a third. Eleanor felt heat crawl up her throat, but she forced her shoulders back. When the Duke reached her, he bowed slightly, his expression grave. "Miss Harrow," he said softly, "will you grant me this dance?" Lydia gasped sharply. Clara clutched Rose's sleeve. Their father stared in stunned silence. Eleanor hesitated only a breath before placing her gloved hand into his. The room parted like a curtain. The orchestra swelled, sending gentle waves of strings through the air as the Duke guided her into the center of the floor. His movements were precise, controlled, and surprisingly tender. She found herself studying the quiet steadiness in his eyes, trying to discern intention beneath restraint. When her steps faltered, he tightened his hold only slightly, supportive, not possessive. "You do not enjoy such attention," he murmured. She lifted her gaze. "I fear becoming an object rather than a person." "As do I," he replied, voice barely audible above the violins. His words unsettled her, hinting at unspoken burdens behind his composed exterior. When the music slowed, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "I do not accept payment in the form your father proposed." His tone carried a quiet fury she had not heard before. "Yet rumor insists I have already chosen you." She met his gaze, breath unsteady. "Then why place me in the heart of this spectacle, Your Grace?" His eyes softened just slightly, because the truth cannot be told in whispers. Before she could ask what truth he meant, the music ended and nobles surged forward, hungry for gossip. She stepped back, pulse racing, aware she had been made the center of a drama she had not chosen. Yet beneath her confusion lay something more dangerous, a flicker of understanding that the Duke's intentions held depth beyond courtesy or scandal. As the crowd murmured around her, she sensed that the question weighing upon her life had shifted. It was no longer whether the Duke would choose her, but what choice he expected her to make when the truth finally emerged. As the evening unfolded, Eleanor grew sharply aware of the Duke's steady gaze, a presence that neither pressed nor withdrew. Though he conversed with other guests, his attention drifted back to her with a quiet intensity she felt like a slow-burning ember beneath her composure. Lydia hovered close, offering brittle smiles, while Rose tried to shield her from the cruelest murmurs. Clara watched everything with anxious eyes, sensing change but unable to give it shape. Near the final hour, the Duke approached again, not with a request for another dance, but with a look that held purpose. "Miss Harrow," he said softly, "there are truths best spoken away from listening ears." A tremor passed through her, born not of fear, but of a fate drawing nearer than she had wished to imagine. And in that moment, she understood that tomorrow would not merely bring an answer, it would bring a reckoning. Night bled into a storm-soaked dawn before Eleanor found the courage to leave her room. All through the restless hours, She had lain awake with the Duke's final words echoing in her mind, truths that needed silence and distance, truths that might undo everything she believed about her father, her future, and him. When she stepped into the corridor, the house was steeped in uneasy quiet. Lydia slept fitfully, dreaming no doubt of titles. Clara murmured prayers in her sleep. Rose, faithful as ever, sighed softly at the foot of their shared bed. Eleanor carried her unease with her, like a fragile lantern whose flame threatened to go out at any moment. A carriage arrived at mid-morning, its wheels cutting neat tracks through the wet earth outside their worn gate. The driver presented a letter sealed with the Ravensbridge crest, inviting Eleanor to the Duke's private study to conclude matters of import. The phrasing struck her as both ominous and strangely considerate, as though he were treading carefully around the delicate fabric of her dignity. Her father, pale from sleepless nights, urged her to go at once. Lydia pouted that Eleanor would embarrass the family by failing to smile. Clara begged her not to be afraid. Rose touched Eleanor's shoulder, offering a silent blessing. Eleanor drew in a long breath, slipped on the walking shoes the Duke had gifted, fitting too well to be coincidence, and stepped into the carriage. Ravensbridge appeared colder this time, its stone facade slicked with rain, windows reflecting a muted world. She was led into a study she had never seen before, a place lined with columns of ledgers, maps, and shelves laden with leather-bound volumes. A fire burned low, filling the room with a steady warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension tightening her chest. When the Duke entered, he paused long enough to take in her posture, her expression, the subtle tremor in her breath. His gaze held gravity, but no triumph. Only the solemn awareness of a man about to alter the path of another's life. "Miss Harrow," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." He motioned toward a chair, but she remained standing. "Your Grace, you said there were truths that could not be spoken in the ballroom. I would hear them now." Lucian Ravensbridge's eyes softened, though he did not sit either. "Very well, then I speak plainly." His hand brushed the edge of a ledger on his desk. "Your father's debt was never a simple matter of poor fortune. He was undermined by Lord Montbarry, his partner, who betrayed him to conceal the misappropriation of funds. Your father took the blame, fearing public ruin, and that fear, Miss Harrow, drove him to act without reason." Eleanor felt the words strike her like cold rain on bare skin. "He believed selling one of us would spare the rest," she whispered, her throat tightening. The Duke nodded once. Fear bends even good men into unnatural shapes. But he was not the architect of his misfortune. A blur formed at the edges of her vision. "And you knew this?" "Yes," he replied. "I discovered it last week. I paid his debt to prevent your family's collapse, and to give Lord Montbarry no further grip upon your lives. But your father remained convinced that only a daughter's sacrifice would cleanse his burden. He did not tell you, because shame can be a prison narrower than poverty." The fire crackled softly, a fragile counterpoint to the thunder rolling in Eleanor's chest. "You let him kneel," she said, voice trembling with a quiet fury she had never unleashed before. "You watch him offer us. Offer me." His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching, as though he had expected the blow. "Yes, because revealing the truth in haste would have destroyed him. And I needed to see, needed to know, which of you bore the weight of that humiliation with grace rather than bitterness. You did, not in silence, but in courage." Her breath faltered. "You tested us, tested me." He stepped closer, the dim light shaping his face into planes of shadow and resolve. "I sought understanding, not dominion. I needed to know whether the woman He stopped, recalibrating the formality of his words. "The woman I held in regard was more than society's cruel measure of her limp or her family's ruin." Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her, as if the floor itself had leaned toward some unspoken truth. "Regard?" she echoed. Her voice was fragile, barely a thread. "Since when?" His reply came without hesitation. "Since the winter your family lost its shop. I saw you carrying home crates of unsold goods through the snow, your steps slow, your hands red with cold. You passed every carriage, every door shut against those in need, and still you did not yield. A woman who endures storms without bending is not easily forgotten. Her breath left her in a soft shudder. You knew me even then. I saw you, he murmured, and I watched you bear responsibilities that were never meant for your shoulders. When your father came to me, I believed it my duty to protect what little remained of your family's dignity. But you let the scandal grow, she whispered. I did, he conceded, because I needed Montbarry to reveal himself, and he has. His fall will be steep, then softer, and because I wish to understand whether your strength was born of fear or conviction. Eleanor turned away, staring at the rain against the tall windows. And what have you concluded? Lucian approached her slowly, as though careful not to disturb something fragile. That you do not simply endure. You choose. That matters more than lineage, more than beauty, more than the expectations of any ballroom. A silence stretched between them, soft, electric, weighted with unsaid possibilities. She felt his presence beside her, warm despite the storm, steady in a way that made her pulse race. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel seen, truly seen, for something beyond her limp, beyond her family's ruin. Miss Harrow, he said gently, I will make a public declaration clearing your name and your father's. But the choice that follows must be yours, not his. What choice? She asked, though her heart already knew. Lucian lifted her chin with a touch so light it scarcely felt real. The choice of whether you will allow this moment, this storm-born truth, to end our connection or begin it. Her pulse fluttered, every breath a trembling boundary between fear and the quiet, terrifying hope rising within her. The fire dimmed, the rain intensified, and the Duke's gaze held hers with an earnestness she had never imagined a man of his rank capable of. Before she could answer, a hard knock echoed through the hall, sharp enough to break the room's fragile stillness. A footman entered, face pale. Your Grace, Lord Montbarry is here, and he demands an audience. Lucian's eyes darkened with a storm of their own. So, he murmured, the reckoning begins. And Eleanor felt the first true tremor of the future waiting to unfold. Dangerous, unfinished, and impossibly close. The drawing room of Ravensbridge was a chamber built for order, not confrontation. Yet as Lord Montbarry strode inside, rain still clinging to his coat like shadows that refused to fall off, Eleanor felt the air thicken with something sharp enough to cut. Sunlight pressed through tall windows and cast long bars of gold across the carpet, falling over Lucian's rigid posture and Montbarry's hastily composed arrogance. Servants withdrew in a rustle of skirts and muted footfalls, leaving the three of them in an uneasy triangle of power, humiliation, and truth. Montbarry's eyes flicked to Eleanor first, taking in her plain dress, her upright stance, her quiet dignity. It was a glance meant to diminish. But Eleanor, still trembling from the Duke's confessions moments earlier, no longer felt small beneath such scrutiny. His presence radiated entitlement, an echo of the very cruelty that had driven her father into despair. Her breath steadied, though her pulse raced, as Lucian stepped slightly ahead of her, like a shield made of calm steel. Your Grace, Montbarry began, his voice dripping with controlled indignation. I've been informed that you intend to bring my name into disrepute with wild accusations concerning Mr. Harrow's debts. I have come to demand an explanation. Lucian regarded him with a quietness that unnerved. Demand? He repeated softly, as if tasting the word. That is bold, given your position. Sit, Montbarry. It was not a suggestion. Lord Montbarry stiffened, but he obeyed, seating himself on the velvet settee with the air of a man forced to partake in his own undoing. Eleanor remained standing. She felt Lucian's nearness at her shoulder, a silent reassurance, though her heart beat in an uneven rhythm she could not tame. Let's be plain, the Duke said. You orchestrated the destruction of Mr. Harrow's business to conceal your misappropriation of shared funds. You redirected blame onto him, confident he would be too afraid of scandal to speak. His voice carried no heat, only precision, each word falling like a stone into still water. And in desperation, he offered one of his daughters to spare the rest. A sin born of cowardice, yes, but a sin you created. Montbarry's jaw tightened. You make wild claims without evidence. Lucien reached for a stack of letters tied with twine. This evidence? He untied them with measured grace. Correspondence between you and Mr. Grayson, the solicitor who helped obscure the missing sums. Ledger entries that shift at your instruction. Witness statements from your own clerks. Montbarry's face began to drain of color. And, Lucien added, his gaze narrowing, records of your intention to frame Mr. Harrow entirely, leaving him without means to recover. Eleanor felt a tremor ripple through her. Her father had been desperate, but she had not imagined the scale of the trap. Montbarry leaned forward, sneer sharpening. Is this about Miss Harrow? His eyes traveled to her, gleaming with insinuation. Has she become your cause, your grace, your reward for posturing as a savior? Before Eleanor could speak, Lucien stepped into Montbarry's line of sight, blocking his view of her entirely. His voice remained low, but a current of warning threaded through it. You will not speak of her, he said. Not in that tone, not with that intent. Something unnamed flickered in Montbarry's expression. Unease, perhaps even fear. The door opened as if pulled by the tension itself. Two senior members of Parliament entered, summoned earlier by the Duke. Their presence changed the air, granting formality to the reckoning that was unfolding. They examined the documents silently, while Montbarry attempted to reassemble his composure, sweat forming at his temple. Eleanor gripped her hands together behind her back, grounding herself. She had never imagined standing witness to such a confrontation, much less being a catalyst for it. At last, the elder statesman spoke. Lord Montbarry, he said gravely, the evidence here is not merely damning. It is comprehensive. Your actions are grounds for censure, loss of title privileges, and criminal inquiry. Shock widened Montbarry's eyes, but the statesman continued unrelentingly. Prepare yourself for formal proceedings. Montbarry rose abruptly, his chair legs scraping against the carpet. This is madness, he spat. Harrow's daughter is. Lucien's cane struck the floor once. The sound cut through Montbarry's words with the finality of a closing door. Do not finish that sentence, the Duke said softly. Her dignity is not yours to address. Eleanor felt something inside her expand, something fragile and warm. No one had ever defended her with such quiet ferocity. Montbarry's mouth twisted with hatred, but he turned away as the officials escorted him from the study. His departure left a vacuum in the room, a hollow echo of the ruin he had nearly brought upon her family. Silence settled. Eleanor released a breath she did not know she had been holding. You should sit, Lucien said gently. His voice had softened again, the edges of command smoothing into something more human. She obeyed, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered herself into a chair. I did not wish you to witness that, he said, but I believe you had earned the truth of those who wronged you. She studied him quietly, the lift of his shoulders, the strain of restraint still taut beneath his calm. You fought for my family, she murmured. For me, more fiercely than my own father ever dared. Lucien lowered himself into the seat across from her, his cane resting against his knee. I did what honor required, he said, and what conscience demanded. Your father's desperation was tragic, but you were the one who bore the deepest wound. His gaze dipped briefly to the shoes he had sent. I intended small kindnesses to ease your path, not to place you at the center of a storm. Her breath trembled. You have done both. Their eyes held, steady, searching, quietly stirring with emotions neither dared yet speak aloud. A slow shift moved through the room, subtle yet undeniable, as though something had tilted inexorably forward between them. The faint crackle of the hearth beneath the mantel filled the silence, warm and intimate. She felt seen, understood, and valued in a way that unraveled something tightly bound inside her. Lucien leaned forward slightly. Eleanor, he said, not Miss Harrow. Eleanor, I will clear your family's name publicly. But before I do, I must ask something far more delicate. Her heartbeat stilled as he continued. If I remove every trace of obligation, every whisper of debt, every shadow of scandal, I wish to know whether you stand before me by your will alone. Her breath fluttered. And what would you do with that knowledge? His voice softened to something dangerously tender. I would decide whether to whisper a question I have no right to ask unless your heart invites it. She felt warmth rise through her chest, fragile and luminous. Before she could form a reply, a footman reappeared, breathless, bowing. Your Grace, he said, the entire household waits in the great hall. They expect your public declaration, whatever it may be. Lucien stood slowly, offering Eleanor his hand. Then let us go, he murmured. Together. And as she placed her trembling fingers into his palm, she felt the world shift again, as though the next breath they shared would change everything yet to come. The great hall of Ravensbridge swelled with murmurs as Lucien and Eleanor descended the staircase. Chandeliers blazed above them like constellations caught in gilt cages, casting warm light over a sea of curious, expectant faces. Nobles stood in clusters, some eager for spectacle, others hungry for scandal. Eleanor moved with quiet resolve, her hand resting lightly in the Duke's, her breath trembling though her posture remained upright. Every whisper scraped against her, but none pierced so deeply as the single truth still unsettled inside her. She had been offered to a man who now held not ownership, but choices he waited for her to make freely. Lucien led her to the center of the marble floor. His expression was unreadable to the crowd, but Eleanor sensed the tension beneath his controlled movements. A hush settled as he turned to face the assembled guests, his voice carrying with a clarity that seemed to still the very air. Ladies and gentlemen, I have summoned you for a matter long overdue. Eleanor felt every heartbeat like a drum against her ribs. Rumors have circulated, Lucien continued. Rumors that Mr. Harrow attempted to offer me one of his daughters in exchange for debt forgiveness. Rumors that I accepted. Several ladies gasped. Fans fluttered nervously. Let me state plainly. The circumstances were born of another man's betrayal, Lord Montbarry, whose actions have now been brought to light. Mr. Harrow is absolved of the debt, and he owes me nothing, not coin, not obedience, and most certainly not the futures of his daughters. A rush of whispered shock swept through the hall. Eleanor saw her father near the back, shoulders shaking, tears glinting in his weary eyes. Rose gripped Clara's hand tightly. Lydia stared at Eleanor with an expression she could not decipher. Pride, envy, perhaps both mingled. Lucien continued, his gaze sweeping slowly across the watching crowd. It is time this tale ceases to be one of humiliation. It must instead become a testament to truth. He paused, his eyes settling upon Eleanor with a steadiness that warmed the very core of her. The Harrow daughters are women of character, dignity, and strength. None shall be bartered under my roof, and none shall be spoken of as if they stood at my door with price tags around their necks. Heat prickled Eleanor's eyes, not from shame now, but from the startling tenderness beneath his words. Yet the hall remained expectant, every ear aching for the part they sensed must come next. However, he said softly, there is one truth I have withheld, not out of deception, but out of respect. A truth that concerns Miss Eleanor Harrow. Her breath caught. The hall leaned in. Rose held Clara closer. Lydia's jaw stiffened. Lucien turned to Eleanor, and though hundreds watched, his voice dropped to something meant only for her. I will not command your future, he murmured, but I must know whether you stand beside me because you wish to, or because you believe gratitude binds you. Her pulse thrummed like a trap bird. She lifted her chin, though emotion tugged fiercely at her throat. I cannot pretend gratitude plays no part, she whispered. You fought for my father's name and mine. But gratitude is not all I feel, your grace. Not anymore. Her voice trembled on the last words, and she feared they were too small to carry meaning. But Lucien's expression shifted with something subtle and profound. Hope sharpened by restraint. He stepped forward, letting the hall fade around them. Then I will speak what I swore I would say only if your heart allowed it. He exhaled softly. Eleanor, will you grant me the honor of courting you properly? Not as a nobleman extending rescue, but as a man who has found in you the rarest of virtues, courage. Gasps rippled. Louder now, astonished, breathless. Lydia clutched a column for balance. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth. Rose began to cry softly. But the hall's noise dissolved as Eleanor looked up at him, eyes full of a fragile, consuming light she had held in check for too long. You asked for my hand in choice, she murmured. Then know my answer comes from the same. She swallowed hard, letting the truth spill quietly from her heart. Yes, your grace. I accept. It was not spoken loudly, but it carried. The hall erupted in whispers, applause breaking like distant thunder. A few noble women glared with envy. Others smiled with unexpected warmth. But Lucien did not look away from her. He lifted her gloved hand gently, brushing his thumb along the back of it. A gesture intimate enough to feel like a vow, yet proper enough for the world watching. He turned to the crowd once more. Let it be known, he declared, that Miss Eleanor Harrow stands beside me by her choosing alone, and that any woman of dignity is beyond price, beyond rumor, beyond the reach of those who would weigh her worth by circumstance. The applause deepened, some sincere, others performative, but all of it distant to Eleanor. Her chest felt full, her breath uneven, as if some long-sealed part of her had cracked open. Her father approached quietly, head bowed, voice thick. Eleanor, forgive me. She took his hands. Already have, she whispered, and she meant it, not as absolution, but as a release that untied the last knot around her heart. Lucien watched the exchange with a quiet gentleness, then extended his arm once more. She stepped toward him without hesitation, and together they walked toward the dais where nobles awaited formal announcements. Yet in that moment, the room seemed to dim around the edges, everything narrowing to the quiet understanding passing between their steps. When they reached the dais, Lucien turned to her with a faint, almost shy smile that startled her with its sincerity. This path, he murmured, will not be easy. The world will question us, but I will not falter. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. Nor will I. Before the officials could begin formalities, the doors at the end of the hall burst open. A messenger stumbled in, breathless, drenched from the storm. Your Grace, he shouted, Lord Montbarry has fled the city, and he has taken the incriminating ledgers with him. Gasps shattered the moment like dropped crystal. Nobles recoiled. Officials surged forward. Lucien's jaw tightened, a storm gathering behind his composed exterior. And Eleanor felt the fragile, new hope she had dared to accept tremble beneath the weight of a future suddenly thrust into chaos. Then it seems, the Duke murmured, his gaze flicking toward the distant storm clouds curling beyond the windows, our peace must wait. And though her hand remained in his, Eleanor felt the entire world tilt once more, toward danger, toward uncertainty, and toward a decision that might demand more courage than any she had given before.